Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Stephanie. I'm a registered dietitian and sport nutritionist, and I work one-on-one with athletes to make sure that they are eating to perform at their best. In the last video, that video was really an introduction to some of the meal guides that I make for my clients and also just on a one-off basis on my website. If you didn't get to watch that video, the link is here. You can go check it out. But today I wanted to show you how I would go about looking at a mixed meal, so either a stew or a casserole, and giving you guys a couple different ways to actually look at what you're making and then estimate how that fits into your meal guide. So I'm going to go through one example here in a couple different methods, and then hopefully that will be helpful for you going forward in the future to make sure that your meals are matching what your meal guide says to do. All right, so let's get into it. The first way that makes a lot of sense to me personally is to divide out what category of food each component of your meal fits into. And then, if, for example, if it's a big stew, finding out how many servings that is going to make you, and then you can divide out how many portions of protein or carbs and fats are in one individual serving. So I'm going to go through that with one of my examples that I made this week, which was a beef stew. So if I look at the recipe that I used, it was 900 grams of stewing beef. So the package that I got was a little bit over 900, but I definitely did cut off a decent amount of the extra added fats that were surrounding some of the pieces of meat. So I'm going to estimate that I had about 900 grams of protein. If you look on the meal guide, roughly about 75 grams of steak or beef would be equal to one serving of protein in the meal guide. The 900 grams divided by 75, which would give you about 12 servings of protein for this whole recipe. So for me, if I only need one serving of protein at a meal, this would technically make me about 12 servings. That is the only source of protein really that this meal is giving me. There's no beans or lentils or other types of meat. So that is going to be my main protein source for this meal. The next component that I am seeing in this recipe is olive oil. So that is the only extra type of fat that is in this recipe as well. So in the whole recipe, it's using 2 tablespoons of olive oil, which would be equal to 6 servings of fats. So if we're going by that 12 serving sizes, each serving would give me roughly half a fat. Next up that I see on this recipe, we have herbs and spices, garlic, celery. We have balsamic vinegar, which if you look at the label is really only going to be giving us roughly 4 grams of carbs for the whole batch of stew, so we aren't really going to consider that in our recipe. And then also we have 2 tablespoons of the tomato paste, which is going to roughly be about 5 grams of carb as well. And so since that is within that whole batch of stew, again, that is something that we aren't going to worry about in our calculations. Other things in there would include our beef broth, which again, if you look at the label, it really doesn't give you a whole lot of those nutrient values. It doesn't have any fat and it barely has any protein or carbs in it, so we aren't considering that in our calculation, so that would be free. And then we get to some of those vegetables that we're adding. So I already mentioned the celery. The carrots are also going to be free if I didn't already mention that. And then we also have the peas that is about 1 cup, which is 1 serving of carbs. So then we're going to get to our potatoes when we're adding this into our stew. It is calling for 2 medium potatoes, so that would roughly give us 4 carbohydrate choices for the whole batch of stew as well. So if you're following along with that, I'm going to divide this recipe into 12 servings so that I can have 1 protein serving, half a fat serving, and about half a carbohydrate serving as well. So now knowing that the 1/12 portion of stew equals all of those different things, I personally, out of my meal, if this is lunch, I'm going to probably need 3.5 extra fats that I'm adding to it, and probably about 3.5 extra carbohydrates that I'm going to be adding to the meal on the side so that I can make sure that I'm matching the amount of carbohydrates and fats that I need to what the meal guide is, because they weren't high enough in this stew. The second way that you might be able to look at your meal and make sure that it is meeting your meal guide, or how many portions potentially are in a specific serving size, is sometimes if you're looking at a recipe, they give you the calories and the macronutrient values for one serving of the recipe that you're making. So I'm going to show you actually the recipe and the macronutrients that they have set out for us, and give you a little bit of explanation of how we can maybe look at this and make sure that we are understanding potentially where our servings are coming from. It does make it a little bit more complicated doing it this way because of the fact that in my calculations, like I was telling you before in the past video, is that a protein also contains a little bit of fat, which I account for in my calculations, and the carbohydrates also account for some of that extra fat and protein as well. And also sometimes if the recipe that you're following has a bunch of vegetables, I have also accounted for that in my calculations, but I've let them be free in your diet, so the carb content of your meals might be a little bit off. All right, so let's take a look at this recipe and the macronutrients. All right, so this is our recipe here. This is from the Looney Tunes cookbook, the Stupendous Beef Stew, and it is actually quite delicious. I do really enjoy this recipe if you're interested in trying it. So if you can take a look up here, so it's going to be saying that this is giving us 6 servings from this whole recipe. So again, we decided that when we were calculating, we would do roughly about 12 servings. So we actually are going to half some of the macronutrients that are listed here. So our total fats would be roughly 6 grams of fat for our serving, because again, we're dividing that in half because we're making 12 servings instead of 6. So if you remember back, we were saying that roughly we would be getting half of a serving of fat, which is 2.5 grams of fat. But we also have a little bit of fat that I have calculated for in terms of how much extra fat that we might be getting from our meat products as well. So that actually balances out to what my macronutrients would be in the meal guide fairly well. If we then look at our protein level, so this is listing 40 grams of protein. If you remember, we're dividing this by 2, so 20 grams of protein roughly. And this again is very close to what we calculated for one protein choice, because one protein choice is again 20 grams of protein. So then if you move down to our carbohydrates, that's giving us 31 grams of carbohydrates. We're dividing that by 2, so 15 grams of carbs, which would be equal to one carb choice. If you remember back to our calculations, we might only be getting about a half of a carb choice in there, and that's because the carbohydrate content from this is also including some of those extra things like the vegetables that we have calculated as free, but are also already built into your meal guide. The final way that you might be able to actually estimate some of the portions that you are getting from your meal is to actually just visually look at your plate and see roughly how much carbs, proteins, and fats that you're getting in that meal. This works a little bit better if it's not something that you're cooking yourself. If it's a meal out, you can kind of estimate portions. It's definitely a little bit more challenging if you don't know how things were prepared, but it can be a good estimate to roughly figure out if you're meeting your meal guide with the meal that you're currently consuming. So let's take a look at my bowl of stew, that 112 kind of serving size, and I'm gonna explain a little bit more how I'm looking at it visually to estimate that portion. All right, let's go. So if this is my beef stew here, I've kind of separated it out a little bit so we can hopefully see it a little bit better and more clearly, but I've piled the meat to the one side. So if I know that palm size, deck of card size portion is going to visually be about 75 grams of protein, you can kind of estimate, okay, that looks roughly about palm size for that amount of protein that I have set out there. So this is roughly 1 protein. And then you can kind of visually take a look at the amount of potatoes. There's not a whole lot in there, so I actually added more potatoes to this because I wanted to boost up the carbs. So I would say that's probably roughly a half a potato potentially. So I might count that as 1 carb instead of just the half like we estimated, because I know I added more. And then, like I said, the fats are a little bit more challenging because I don't know how much I've added in here. Visually, I don't see any of the added fats. There's no avocado, there's no nuts or seeds, so I'm just estimating maybe 1 teaspoon of oil went into this, so maybe 1 fat choice, but we know that it's roughly about half a fat choice. But that's how you could estimate just by looking at your plate and going based off of a visual. That is it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you found that helpful to know how to fit your mixed meals into your meal guide. If you have any questions, post them below and I'll answer those. And if not, I will see you in the next one. Bye!